Okay. All right, so it's 10, so we'll go ahead and get started, and anyone else who jumps in can follow along once they're in the Zoom link. Hi, my name's Erica, and I will be today's moderator for our second webinar. I'm the Human Resource Manager at Acena, and I'm really excited to be here at our second out of 3 webinars. Just a few key points while everyone's still joining in for today's webinar. To receive the 1 hour of CPE, you must be in the webinar for at least a minimum of 50 minutes and answer 3 out of 4 of the polling questions. And a recording of today's webinar will go out later today. Questions during the webinar can be asked through the chat function, which I'll be monitoring the entire time of the webinar, or you can raise your hand with the emoji function at the bottom of your screen. Just a reminder, if you do put questions in the chat, please make sure your questions are not anonymous. If we don't get an opportunity to answer those questions during the webinar, we'll follow up with you directly, but we have to make sure we know who you are. So make sure your questions, we can see who's asking. At the end of the webinar today, you'll get a link to a short survey, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on that. We got some awesome feedback from the last webinar that we really appreciated. So any feedback and all feedback is welcome. Following the webinar from last week and the responses of the polling questions, we changed up 2 things for today's webinar to make it more interactive and interesting. The first is that we added slides as part of the webinar, and that will be part of the discussion today. The second is several times during the webinar, we'll be using breakout rooms for smaller group discussions that will allow for more direct conversations with one presenter. Questions or comments from the breakout rooms will be highlighted once we rejoin the group altogether. As from last week, we look forward to your participation, thoughts, and comments on your format as we continue to improve. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. We have Ray Smoltz, who is our project manager at Acena Consulting and has more than 8 years of experience in the professional service. Her clients have ranged from Fortune 500 companies to small startup companies, and her clients range from manufacturing to engineering, technology, software, and agriculture. Ray graduated from the University of Rhode Island and holds degrees in business administration, environmental natural resource economics, and sustainability, with minors in environmental engineering and neuroscience. We have Randy Eickhoff, who is the founder and head coach at Acena Consulting. With more than 20 years of experience working with companies on tax incentives, Randy brings significant experience and expertise to each client, helping them to better understand and monetize the value of R&D tax credit and cost segregation studies. Randy began his career at Arthur Andersen in Southern California and holds a degree of business economics from UC Santa Barbara. And our host today, Nick Pizzo, is director at Acena Consulting. As founder of 3 successful businesses, Nick brings an entrepreneurial perspective to his clients, helping them recognize the greater impact of tax incentives that apply to their companies. Nick frequently serves as keynote speaker, presenter, and trainer on business optimization topics, including customer service, effective communication, and growth through networking. He is a former professional musician, performer, and songwriter. And with that, I will start off with our first polling question. All right, can everyone see that?
No. While you guys are going through the polling question, just a quick welcome and glad you guys are all here for part 2 of our 3-part series. It's going to be an exciting, well, if you're a tax person, it's an exciting discussion today about 2 pretty pivotal questions.
Thanks, Randy. I'll go ahead and give the polling question a full minute before I go ahead and end that. So 30 more seconds for those to participate.
Good morning, Tara.
Good morning.
I like this view so much better. We can see everybody.
Yeah, I like this a lot better.
All right. Go ahead and end that polling question. Share those results with everyone.
All right.
Thanks, guys. And with that, I go ahead and pass it over to Nick Pisa.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining. Thanks for attending. Some of you first time, some of you repeat. Appreciate it. So before we actually start the webinar, I just want to quickly review the learning objectives of this session so you'll know what we're going to be discussing. The first is we're going to review the Little Sandy Coal court decision, as well as the appeals case to that decision. We're going to review the Scott and Gayla Moore, also known as the Moore case, that court decision, and all the details in that, the impact on documentation for the R&D credit from these decisions that the IRS has started to use. And finally, we're going to review some suggestions for better documentation practices as we see things sort of skewing in that direction. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So Randy, let's start with the great news. As many of you know, or some of you are aware, the Tax Relief for Families and Workers Act passed the House last week, right after our webinar. Coincidence? Maybe. But the Senate is now on the hot seat to get this passed. And as you've been following what's going on in the Senate, not necessarily top of mind, but certainly not forgotten. And so we're sort of waiting and watching. So Randy, if you don't mind, on today, Wednesday, what do we know about the status?
Yeah, well, 1 week out, right? And unfortunately, the Senate has been really focused on the border issue, which has been top of the news. And so we haven't heard a lot. What I can tell you is that one of the authors of the tax relief bill was the leader of the Senate Finance Committee. And obviously, they're the ones that are going to drive this into the floor for discussion, then hopefully to be passed and moved on to the president's desk. NAM, the National Manufacturers Association, has been pressing hard on Congress to get this done quickly. And the IRS is gearing up to be able to manage this in the event that Congress can get this passed. So all the players are really positioning themselves to be able to execute when this goes through. We're obviously very bullish that it will. But right now it's I don't want to call it a sit and wait game, but it just needs to get to the top of the agenda for the Senate. And the more that we've got industry groups and folks reaching out to their Congress people to get this done, the faster it's going to get done. But we do believe it will happen.
So it sounds like even though there's a lot of noise in the media about other things the Senate's doing or not doing, the worker bees are slowly putting this together and doing business as usual to help everybody out. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I saw an article today from Accounting Today, and the IRS has said they need about 6 weeks to be able to really implement the changes in the child tax credit. But that for folks that file their tax returns before these changes happen, the systems are in place to automatically kick the refund out to them. So it's not like they'll have to file them in a return. So people are lining up to make sure this happens effectively.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Okay, well, that's a nice kickoff. Why don't we go into our court cases for the day? The first one I'm going to start with is a company called Little Sandy Coal. And so, Ray, good morning. Thanks for being here. Why don't you give everybody, if you don't mind, sort of a background on the case?
Of course. Good morning. So this case is revolved around the development and building of 11 vessels that were part of a subsidiary of the company. And within this case, there were 2 of these 11 projects that were vetted in detail. The taxpayer argued that more than 80% of the elements of each vessel were novel, and that the work of the production employees supported research. They were building each vessel and claimed they were all pilot models. And as such, it constituted elements of a process of experimentation throughout building. As their work made up around 87% of all the work on the vessel, they passed the substantial all tests, which they claimed was met. The court's decisions, however, said that 80% of the substantially all tests needed to apply to the activities, not the physical components themselves. and those who provided direct support or direct supervision were not necessarily engaged within these qualified R&D activities. And so supply expenses were not to be included in the fraction that determined that 80% test, as they are not activities, they're supplies. And because the court used these above definitions, the taxpayer did not meet their burden of proof that the research activities constituted a process of experimentation.
Amazing. So even though we have these new vessels, the companies never built them. They have new and novel components. The court disallowed the expenses because the taxpayer didn't accurately define their process of experimentation.
Yes, that's correct.
Wow. So, okay, so I think it would help if you drill down a little bit on those specific facts that the court used or didn't, right, to make those determinations.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first project that we have was the Apex tanker. And this was a barge built under contract. The barge had several novel design changes from a different model that they had called the Pen 80 that they had built in the past. The two novel design components detailed within the case were the towering sorry, I apologize. The towering bindle and the bow of the boat, allowing the tug to pull it. These proposed designs were tested through software modeling and engineering calculations that were done on an iterative basis. Additionally, the engineering calculations were completed for sizing of the anchor, testing of the strength of the tanker's longitudinal elements, and then designing of the vapor barrier system. The last component that the design changes went through were determined iteratively to allow it to handle more cargo than the Pen 80 was ever considered for. And so time record analysis of the production employees determined that 87% that I mentioned above, that was actually spent constructing the Apex tanker, which involved different functions tied directly to items that did differ from that Pen 80. I would like to highlight that there were time records to substantiate the time spent establishing that it was built spending on the pilot model itself. And for those who are not familiar with that concept, a pilot model is defined as a working model that is built to eliminate uncertainty. So that was the first project that we kind of noticed that they had vetted in detail. The second project was the dry dock. And this was another project that was built under contract. And this was a floating structure used for ship repair and maintenance. And the taxpayer had never built a dry dock before. So the initial design and modeling that was done iteratively throughout software and using engineering calculations were to test for special conflicts. And that included the outboard side plate and the safety deck specifically required several iterations for each design.
You know, so if someone came to me with this and said, Nick, do you think we qualify? I'd be listening to these two projects and I'd say, yeah, it sounds like you meet the 4-part test. I hear the technical uncertainty. You've never done it before. Will this work? Let's have a process, commercial use, right? I mean, first blush, I think it passes. So what happened?
I would agree. From a 10,000 foot view, it definitely has R&D going on. But as you'll see, through drilling down, it gave better insight to how the court evaluated the projects and more importantly, the activities and the documentation aspect of it. So looking at some of the documentation noted for the expenses in the case, there were 3 points that really stood out. One was time tracking was available for the production employees, but not the management team. The wage qualified research expenses also included time for 3 draftsmen specifically, as well as contract research was paid for well testing that could have been due to design flaws or workmanship issues.
Okay. Which, you know, time tracking for management, that's not really common in a company unless it's super huge. It's usually just for the line employees and things like that. So interesting they drilled down on that piece. So, well, thanks, Ray. So Randy, what's your take on all this?
You know, this is something we run into with all our clients all the time, and that is that the documentation that the management team actually puts together to track their activities and their time can be a little bit on the light side. And this case highlights that exactly. There was no time tracking and no activity tracking to really differentiate the management's time between non-qualified tasks and qualified tasks. And ultimately, as as we unpack this, as you're going to see, that became a significant issue, and it cost them.
Crazy. So it's really though, like, process of experimentation, right? Like, because that's where it kind of, I think, all comes around is did they conduct qualified research under Section 41, right? Did they have any special exclusions, like on 41 sub D, sub 4 that need to apply? And now, based on that, what's the includable amount of qualified research activities, right? So, Ray, that second question from the court about exclusions. What are exclusions to 41 and how do they factor into this?
Yeah, so the excluded activities that they were referring to are research after commercial production, adaptation of an existing business component, duplication of an existing business component, studies, surveys, market research, etc., and foreign research. But I would like to note that in reality, none of these were a factor in this case.
Okay, sorry. So, Randy, how does the court decide on qualified research? How did they do it in this case?
Yeah, so this came down to that substantially all test that Ray mentioned a little bit earlier. And so to break that down a little bit, that says that 80% or more of the expense or other reasonable measure must involve the process of experimentation. And for those that remember the 4-part test, you know that the process of experimentation is that iterative evaluation of different alternatives to alleviate those technical uncertainties we identified at the front end of the project. And what happened in this one was that they didn't do a good job identifying what was the process of experimentation and how did they pass the substantially all test. What's fascinating to me about this court case is that the court recognized when you read through this that there was R&D going on, qualified R&D going on. The problem was that when you tried to quantify that 80% test, they didn't do it. They didn't do it effectively.
Which we're allowed to do. Okay, so I can't believe the taxpayer went, well, good job, I'm good, that's cool. There had to be some pushback, right?
There was, and the taxpayer argued that greater than 80% of all of the components and the time spent on those was novel. And so because that was novel, that met that threshold for the 80% test. Remember that earlier Ray had mentioned that they quantified 87% of the time spent was by the production employees to build the ship, right? To build the ship. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it should be pretty straightforward to say, well, if the building of the ship was required to test out those components, then that's a pilot model, and therefore that time should all qualify. Well, if you strip that out all of a sudden, now you're not even close. And unfortunately, the way that the courts ultimately defined qualified research, engaged in qualified research, really threw a curveball into the 80% test and how we've always quantified it and calculated it.
Okay, so Trinity versus US, that was a R&D credit case, right? Where new and novel craft were designed. The court in that case said 2 of the ships did qualify, and so therefore they did so based on the cost of the craft rather than the effort. So
that's right. That's right. And the court, and this is what's really fun about this case. This court decided not to follow Trinity. And the biggest reason that they didn't, and they mentioned it during the case in the brief when you read through it, the reason they didn't is they said in Trinity, the court never did the quantification. They never did the calculation to say, show me 80%. They just said, we've got these new novel ships. They're, first in class. Therefore, we're going to accept them and sort of assume that we meet that 80% test.
Well,
that became a kind of a problem.
Yeah. Wow. So they just decided not to follow that decision.
Right.
Crazy. Well, I think this is a good spot to stop for a moment. And Erica, do you want to do polling question number 2 for us?
I would love to. All right, so go ahead and give that one a minute as well.
I hope you guys appreciate these questions, by the way. It took us some time to figure them out.
I don't see my name listed as one of the choices.
I forgot that one. Nick,
All
while,
right.
while people are finishing that up, I just wanted to emphasize that, Trinity, the courts actually included insurance costs as part of the qualified expenses, which, as we all know, it's not one of the areas we can throw that in. And so because of that, I think this court really didn't want to follow that. They didn't feel like that the calculation and the way the court had come up with their decision followed.
Hmm.
Looks like Taylor
So
Swift took this one.
she's probably going to get more airtime than a lot of the folks on the field, unfortunately. All right. So the taxpayer also argued in this case that the fabrication and the building of the ship, right, pilot model, they needed to eliminate uncertainty, and therefore that's qualified research. So the time spent by those production employees is qualified time. And this is where the court really kind of went off the rails. And as we're going to see, they didn't follow the statutes and they didn't follow the regulations. And it got very confusing as you try to read through it and understand their rationale. The definition under 41B of qualified services are services that constitute engaging in qualified research or engaging in direct supervision or direct support of research activities which constitute qualified research. So the statute doesn't make a distinction. It's 2 bullet points, if you will, in the statute, but it's all defined as qualified research. The regulations back that up, and they say direct support or research includes the services of, and in one of their examples, a machinist for machining a part of an experimental model used in qualified research, which arguably is what we have here, right? We've got production employees building a ship, and this is where this is where things get really strange. They agreed that with the taxpayer that the Apex tanker, if we assume that's an experimental model, then the time spent by production would be qualified time. Now stay with me on this. Meaning if technical uncertainty still existed, that in order to alleviate, right, we've got to build this boat, this pilot model, and arguably that time would count toward qualified time. Now, let's review that fraction really quickly. Qualified, so research time is your denominator. Okay, doesn't necessarily process experimentation time, but just any time spent on research. The numerator is time spent in the process of experimentation. Okay. The court argued, I hope everybody's buckled in. The court argued that direct supervision and direct support are not engaged in qualified research and therefore cannot be included in the numerator. It's not what the statute says, but that's the way that they interpreted it in this particular case. So from the case, the work of production employees directly supports the research involved in testing the model, but the production work does not have a close enough nexus to the testing to be considered qualified research in its own right. The fabrication and use of experimental model in qualified research are by definition 2 different things. The latter is qualified, the former is not. So if I am reading this correctly, what the court is saying is the building of the pilot model doesn't qualify as qualified research, but testing it does. I'm not sure I follow the logic.
It built itself, because why supervise it or why have somebody designing it, right? That's just.
Yeah, it just doesn't follow. So court goes on to say, we don't agree that the activities are in direct support, that they are considered an element of the process of experimentation and are claimable. So they threw them out. And so ultimately the court, I mean, if you think about this, right, for the folks on this call that have been involved in R&D, think about it for a second. There's very few opportunities where if you throw out direct support and direct supervision that you're ever going to meet that 80% test. And so that it just doesn't follow that that's what Congress had wanted when they initially enacted this. And this the way that they are approaching this doesn't follow any court case that I have seen in the past. So it just doesn't make any sense. So without digging deeply into the dry dock project, they followed the same pattern of logic and how they defined engaging in qualified activities. They eliminated time spent by production from the numerator of that equation, and they throw it out. Now, there's a concept called the shrinking back rule. And very simply, it says that if we don't meet that 80% test here, and we're going to call that at the ship level in this case, we can shrink back to a smaller part. And arguably, you would look at the design of these novel components and say, well, do we meet the 80% test here?
Mhm.
Problem for the taxpayer is there was no documentation, and they didn't bring anything to support, well, if we don't fit here, we're going to shrink back to these levels. They brought in zero documentation to be able to do that. And so they really approach this as kind of an all or nothing defense, if you will.
Wow. So if I need to build a frame in order to build my prototype, I can't include the frame, but I can include the prototype. But I need the frame to build the prototype, right? Same idea here?
Yeah.
Wow.
No sense at all.
Wow. Erica, I noticed we have a question in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Nick. The question is, what could have happened if they broke it into phases, research and design separated from building, separate from testing?
It's a good question, and arguably they should have been able to qualify something in this case. As we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes as well, management didn't track any of their time either, so the court ended up throwing that out as well. But theoretically, if you broke that down into different stages and defined where we have process of experimentation, right, where we have that iterative evaluation of alternatives, then you should have been able to qualify time in each of those stages. But they didn't do that. And quite honestly, this is one of the changes in documentation that we've seen over the last year is the IRS and the courts have never asked for this level of documentation. And now they're doing this, right? They're getting more micro in terms of what they're looking for. Good
So
question.
Randy, looking at that question, what could have happened? Had they done that, you think this would have passed it?
They would have had a better shot.
Better shot.
Yeah, I mean, the hardest question, and we'll talk about this later in this webinar, but should we be tracking time? Right, we have it for the production employees. In this particular case, and the appeals court talks about this as they dig into it, but the testing that happened on the back end of this project after the ship was built was really to determine how much cargo the ship could hold relative to the size and everything else. And the argument that was made by the court was, this doesn't feel like they're testing the design. They're just testing how much cargo they could actually could manage. And so the question from the court was, well, if we knew the boat was going to float, then the testing that happened was more quality control than it was design testing. And therefore, the building of this pilot model may not really have been a pilot model. So if we throw that out, now can we look at a smaller subset, right, of engineering time and draftsman time and management time and meet that 80% test?
Yeah. Erica, looks like we have another question.
Yeah, thank you. So how would that apply to software with no physical project? Would you just document activities and costs of the cloud computing to build it?
Yeah, so experimentation is allowed within technology, if you will. So if I've got a design in a CAD system and I'm going through an iterative process within that system to test different concepts and designs, different materials, different thicknesses, different ways to connect things together, that iterative process happening in the CAD system and that modeling is absolutely qualified time. Good question.
There you go. Okay, thanks, Jeff. So just kind of boil it down to key issues. Documentation needed to meet the 80% test was not provided.
Right.
The court defined direct supervision and direct support as not engaged in qualified research.
Yep.
And then I guess time tracking and the detailed activities around that for the management team were not provided. Right.
Correct.
So, wow. But okay, so Ray, back to you. I'd love to get your insight on this. We know it went to appeals. So we have to assume the appeals court provided some clarity, right, regarding some of the lower court's conclusions?
They provided some clarity, but at the end of the day, they still agreed with the lower court, which did not change the overall result for the taxpayer. So let me kind of break down the appeals court and where they agreed and disagreed with that lower court. The appeals court agreed with the definition of the 80% test of process of experiment activities and research activities not excluded. They also agreed that the 80% test is applied to activities and not the physical elements. So even though the ships in this court's case were brand new, the novelty was not considered. The activities needed to be applied under the process of experimentation. The appeals court also agreed that if the lower court cannot ascertain or calculate the substantially all test at the business component or the ship level, they needed to evaluate the same test at the component level as well. The appeals court agreed and disagreed with the way that the lower court applied the testing of the pilot model and application of the 80% test. Remember the lower I don't know if you remember, but the lower court looked at these ships both as pilot models used to resolve uncertainty and non-pilot models. Uncertainty was eliminated before production. They reasoned that the direct supervision and direct support were not engaged in qualified research and therefore excluded them from the numerator of the fraction. The appeals court did disagree with this conclusion.
Okay.
To put it simply, the appeals court reasoned that if activities could produce pilot models or not qualified research, then they should not be included in either the numerator or the denominator and vice versa. They highlight several examples from the regulations to kind of bring to light their conclusion. Ultimately, the taxpayer did not demonstrate that they met the definition of process of experimentation. The appeals court followed the lower court's approach in applying the substantially all test under both assumptions. As Randy mentioned earlier, if we assume the ships are not pilot models, all production wages are not to be considered. The appeals court removed the production wages from the analysis altogether. Because the taxpayer did not provide any details of the activities performed by management, that they could not be analyzed and they could not be evaluated how much each should be included in the numerator of the fraction. The court did not accept unsupported estimates of time spent by management personnel, and the testimony at trial did not provide enough support to be accepted by the courts either. An interesting side note is that the lower court disallowed the draftsman wages as they were simply drawing what the engineers told them to draw within their CAD system. The appeals court reasoned that because there was no documented process of experimentation using the drawings, the lower court's reasoning was sound. If we assume the ships are pilot models, the appeals court concluded that the taxpayer still did not show how the pilot model was used as process of experimentation. So as an overall result, the appeals court agreed with the lower court in the amount of documentation provided for the process of experimentation, which was virtually none, was insufficient to support their claims.
Sorry for shaking my head, everyone, but I just don't see it. Erica, it looks like we have another question. Or a couple, actually.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, we have a couple that came into the chat. The first one are there particular types of businesses that will qualify without doubt to bypass all the confusion for the business?
Lorenzo, what's interesting about this case, and we'll see this as well in the next one, is that there was qualified R&D going on here, right? So the court acknowledged it both at the lower court level and at the appeals level. The question wasn't whether or not they're doing qualified research. They just didn't document it in a way that the courts could quantify how much was being done and by who. And that's why it got thrown out. This has nothing to do with whether or not qualified research was happening. So is there businesses or industries that without a doubt qualify? I will tell you yes and no. As we know in section 174, which is the code section for R&D expenditures, which currently have to be capitalized, they call out software development. Why? Because software development is iterative at its core. You just can't develop software without some iterative, right? You write a couple lines of code, you test it, you write a couple more, you test it, you go back, you change it. It's just the way that software is developed. So I would argue that that's an industry that absolutely should qualify without a doubt. And the fact that they call it out in 174 tells me that Congress agrees at the same time. That said, if you haven't documented it properly, you're going to get thrown out in an audit. It's not a pretty sight. And The courts, unfortunately, I think, would follow that if you're not documenting things in an appropriate manner.
Randy, it sounds like it kind of feeds into our next question. Erica?
Yeah, our next question, am I missing something, or does this sound like a provider didn't do their due diligence when it came down to providing documentation that backs the activities? Because it sounds like there were definitely qualified activities there. Also, is there a difference between pilot model and prototype, just the use?
So good question. So let me answer the back half of that first, and that is that a pilot model and a prototype are just the same words. Pilot model is what's used in the regulations. We always call those prototypes. It's one and the same. In terms of did the provider do their due diligence and documentation, that's a loaded question. And I say that because this is the first time that we have seen this level of documentation required by the courts. I don't know if that's because the IRS has changed their tactics in terms of the way that they are going after this when it gets to the court level, or if this is because the courts are just demanding a higher level of documentation. So the biggest challenge that providers have, like us, is that we develop documentation under a certain level, right? Certain standard today that we're seeing in the courts. Tomorrow, right? A year from now, 2 years from now, that study that we did now gets audited, and we develop the documentation on this standard. Well, 2 years from now, the standard is going to change. It's going to be a different level of documentation they're looking for. So arguably, the work that was done on Little Sandy was probably done 3 or 4 years ago when the courts weren't asking for what they're asking for today. So did the provider do their job? They probably could have done a better job. But this is dynamic, right? Everything's changing on the fly. And so it makes it more difficult both for the taxpayer and for the providers to put the right package together to make sure that everything is documented. And that's why we're here today and next week as well and talking about documentation.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for those questions. Thank you, Randy. So Ray, can we take like 3 minutes and let's go to a breakout room and we'll talk through what you just heard, and we'll come back together just in a few minutes and wrap up this case or answer any more questions that may come out from the breakout sessions. So Ray, Randy, myself will help moderate those, and we'll see what we can come up with.
All right.
All right. I'll give you guys about 3 to 4 minutes in the breakout room and then send a 30-second comeback time. Everyone should be assigned to a room. If you're not, please let me know. For those still in here, are you guys able to see the join breakout room option? Thanks, Allison. I just want to make sure everyone gets enough time in those rooms. Just gonna double check again. You guys should have gotten an invite to a breakout room. If you can see that, please join them.
Sorry, mine won't connect because I was on the phone.
Oh,
I
you're
was
good.
in.
I can
Oh, you can
reassign
see.
you.
Okay, I see.
I just reassigned you. So go ahead and join that when you get a moment. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you guys had enough time in the breakout rooms.
Yeah, it was almost enough. It's like by the time you get the rhythm of it, right?
It's
So,
over.
well, we'll start with Ray. Ray, did you get any questions or comments do you think that would be beneficial for the group to hear?
Yeah, so it was a kind of a follow-up on that cloud computing costing question. And so I think it's important to note that for software development, the cloud computing costing that does qualify is in reference to the development and testing space. So cloud computing around storage and holding code is something that wouldn't qualify. And so I think that was the biggest takeaway from our breakout.
That's huge. Thank you. Randy?
Yeah, I mean, we just really talked about the fact that the documentation standards, they're changing. And so while we all think we're doing a good job with it, understanding where the court's head's at is a little scary, as well as we just need to make sure that we're continuing to improve that going forward.
We had some good discussion. It really was around documentation and the level of it. We had one question about, do we do that with our clients? Do we get this level? And I said, it's like the extra credit question on the test. Do that one too, do more than you need. So should you get challenged, you can go, yes, we did. And here's our proof. And we recognize small businesses sometimes don't have the time to work on the business when they're in it, but have something, whether it's a business diary, time tracking, project tying back, something to where we say, yes, you did this. Can you prove it? Yeah, we can. And so that was a good takeaway from our group as well as to the rest of the groups. So, and if anything else comes up, please just raise your hand in the chat. So Randy, you want to summarize the appeals case?
Yeah, I mean, the takeaways from this really are about one, from the appeals side. Management activities absolutely have to be tracked, right? And that's the area where most of our clients don't do that. And so these are the most highly compensated people in the company. They're the brains behind a lot of the new development that's going on. Without them, a lot of the R&D doesn't happen because they're the ones who are going to start it, as well as lead the charge for the engineers. And so that's the biggest bang for your buck. You got to track the activities of the management personnel. The second piece is that documenting the whole process, right, from start to finish. What are all the steps involved, and where do we have those iterative processes going on versus not? Because that's going to help you with that 80% calculation. And then lastly, from the appeals court, thankfully, direct support and supervision should be included.
Okay, so do you have like their synopsis, the appeal synopsis? Like how they sum it up?
I will. I'm going to hit that, and then we're going to need to really roll since we've spent a lot of time in this case. Here's the last part of the court case, you guys, and I think this is a good summation. Lesson for taxpayers seeking to avail themselves of the research tax credit is to adequately document that substantially all of the activities were research activities that constitute elements of a process of experimentation. Generalized descriptions of uncertainty, assertions of novelty, and arbitrary estimates of time performing experimentation are not enough.
There you go. Just supports that. So why don't we break up the heaviness? Polling question.
All right. Polling question number 3. I'll go ahead and give that a minute. While everyone's answering that, there was a question in the chat. Would it be possible to provide a link to the IRS regulations that were mentioned in this session, section 41 ETAL? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We have that, right? We can link to the IRS, yeah.
All right. About 20 more seconds for that polling question. All right. Thanks everyone who participated in that.
Oh, okay. So I know we're pressed for time, but it's also important, so we'll keep it very concise, but still valuable. The second case is the one of Moore versus Commissioner. And you'll see right up the get-go why this is critical. It was decided just last March and focuses on documentation. And so what we're going to do, excuse me a second. So what we're going to do is talk about documentation by management and whether that compensation can be included. So we'll jump to you, Ray. Again, can you give us the background and facts on the case?
Yeah, of course. So Nevco, the taxpayer in this case, is a S corporation. So the company designed and manufactures scoreboards mostly for schools. The individual in the case focuses on the president and COO, Mr. Robert. His background, which was important to this case, was that he was a software engineer, a CIO at an electronics firm, and a VP at another electronics firm where he focused on manufacturing initiatives. He then went on to be a manufacturing consultant for his own consulting firm. At Nevco, he received both regular compensation and bonuses that were substantial to his bonus and increases of the enterprise value as a whole. As president, he oversaw the operations of new product development, and he was the direct supervisor to the director of engineering, as well as several other individuals. The engineers at Nevco reported to the director of engineering, and they did not record how their time was spent, which is a key point. Mr. Robert and the director of engineering met daily to discuss ongoing engineering projects, and Mr. Robert was heavily involved in new product development. 5 representative projects were discussed as part of the trial as a whole, and Mr. Robert was extensively involved in many aspects of the development, from concept to detailed interactions with each of the engineers. In the case notes that Mr. Robert directed the engineers to build prototypes, functionality, and was deeply involved in the design and backend database for scoreboard that transmitted data directly to people's personal phones. The question that was before the court was whether to include compensation paid to Mr. Robert in calculating their R&D tax credit.
Wow. Like, how can you not say he was involved, right? So I think on the surface, we have involvement with engineering, manufacturing. He's got that background. He's got patents. Is there anything else we need to know about this?
Yeah, so first, that the overall management structure of the company was very, very relaxed. It was so relaxed that even Mr. Roberts' bonus plan, which, by the way, resulted in more than $1 million bonus in year 1, was not written and documented. And secondly, Mr. Robert was named on a patent that was in process during the tax years that were in question. And thirdly, the testimony at the trial confirmed that Mr. Robert was heavily involved in the development efforts of all new products.
Perfect, right? So thank you, Ray. So Randy, why is this even at the court level? It seems like there's a lot of evidence. Mr. Roberts involved, and he's involved in qualified activities, right? So
I mean, when I read through this, I thought I'm not sure I understand. This should be a slam dunk for the taxpayer. He was heavily involved in the process for development. He's got an engineering background. He's working with these engineers on a direct basis. But ultimately, we're going to see documentations where we went sideways.
I'll say, I mean, right?
Okay, so this is the same thing we saw in Little Sandy Coal, right? So
So,
let's
yeah, start with IRS. What were the issues they had, right?
Yeah, so the IRS, their biggest challenge was that Mr. Robert, being president and COO, had a lot of duties, right? So he's running manufacturing, he's running engineering, he's running all the operations of the company. And while the testimony supported the fact that he is involved in the engineering process, what did they not provide? No time tracking, no breakdown of their activities, none of that stuff.
When he clearly was there. So I know we're on time. Let's do a quick breakout room. Let's stop right there. Think about this. You're the court. How should you view Mr. Roberts' involvement? Okay. And should his time with the engineers be included as qualified research or direct supervision, or both? So Erica, if you can throw us out, we'll do that.
All right, all the rooms should be open and everyone should be assigned. If you don't have a pop-up, just let me know. For other Acena employees on the call, you don't have to join the breakout room if you don't want to. Don't worry about it. You guys are definitely more than welcome to hang out with me. I do not have a tax background, therefore I cannot answer any tax questions you may have. So I would highly suggest joining one of the big breakout rooms with our experts. Welcome back, everyone.
That was the fastest 3 minutes I have ever seen. That was faster than Chris Berman.
The good
You're
news is we can
welcome.
document it. We can document it. So, so why don't we do the same thing? Questions and comments that came out. Ray?
So I apologize. I don't know if I'm gonna say your name right. If you could say it, that would be awesome.
I bet you're talking to Ned, right? Nemanja?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he summed it up perfectly. It kind of came down to documentation. The point in question wasn't if he was doing qualified work, but how much of that work was qualified. And then we did talk about the bonus and reasonability and if that should have been included or not. So it was not necessarily questions, but just a great conversation.
Randall?
Yeah, as we all know, management typically doesn't track time, and so now it's become an issue in the courts. And I think that if you want that time to be considered, you're going to have to track it. You can do that in meeting notes, you can do that in emails, but the best thing to do is have some sort of a time tracking system.
We had one that this is in a weird way, a real win for the taxpayer at large, because now it says, yeah, direct supervision counts. Yes, it counts. Just make sure you can document it. So that was a bit of a relief, I think, for folks that are going, listen, I'm involved. Does it work? So we had an interactive, short but interactive time. So Randy, help us with the ending here. Where does the court take these projects and everything that happened?
Yeah, so the takeaways from the Moore case are actually pretty straightforward from this one. Documentation really needs to be done for everybody, including the executives in the company, and more importantly, those folks because of their pay scale. I'd love to dig into this a little bit more, and I just want to be cognizant of our time because we've only got 3 or 4 minutes. I know we've got one more polling question, but we're going to kick these slides out to everybody, make sure they've got them. The other last comment I'll make is on that patent safe harbor. Mr. Robert was named on a patent, and that wasn't enough for the court because they couldn't discern how much time on that project was qualified time versus product development or new product development time. And for that reason, let me say it, he was chopped.
Crazy. So right now, obviously, it's a challenging environment, right? And there's a lot of ramifications we have to manage here. So, Randy, where do we go from here?
Yeah, well, number one, we got to get R&D expensing back. And so that's the biggest issue that I know hits everybody hard on this call. But in terms of recommendations, taking the credit really is a benefit. And I can understand how the courts want better documentation. That said, the right process is going to vary by company because everybody has different systems, everybody has different processes. So creating the right playbook is absolutely critical. It's going to make it an efficient, consistent process. And, candidly, engineering companies, software development companies, they probably have a leg up on other companies because their work is typically better documented. They kind of have to, with all the changes in software, and engineers typically still track on an hourly basis. So even when they bill on fixed fee, they're ahead of the game, if you will.
Real quick along that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, last week I'm going to just shift gears here because again, time. Last week we introduced 2 concepts that we're going to unpack in a bigger way next week in our final webinar. And one, that companies really do need to have that playbook where everyone is involved in the R&D projects. And then number 2, we talked about those 4 pillars for good documentation. And so information, we'll talk more about what that entails. Creating the right process, creating a system that consistently can be applied, and then most importantly, how do we keep everybody accountable and making sure that they're tracking their time, and mostly the president and the COO of the company making sure that they're grabbing theirs. So we really intentionally set these webinars up to bring it together in the last one that we're going to do next week, where we'll give you guys some tools and some tactical things that you'll be able to walk away with and hopefully improve the documentation systems at your companies and at your clients.
Thank you, Randy. Real quick, we have another question in the chat, which I think would be a nice cap to this discussion. Erica?
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. If the president meeting with the CSO/CIO, who meets with the engineering manager, who meets with the research lead, who supervises an engineer who is doing the research, how high up the org chart can we include wages?
Great.
So we can do the person actually doing the qualified activity 1 level away from support and 1 level up for supervision. And so the supervisor would be able to qualify, but the supervisor of the supervisor wouldn't.
Hopefully, yeah, that said it right there. So, Ray, anything you'd like to add to wrap up on this?
Nope.
You're good. Randall?
No, I think let's finish up our polling question and then we'll get recording this out to everybody when we're done.
Perfect.
All right. In the chat as well, I'm also going to put a link to the survey if you guys wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to fill that out for us. That way we can improve our webinar for the 3rd one next week. Thank you, Ray, Nick, and Randy for all the information. I know we covered a lot. And as Randy said, we will be sending out a link to the Zoom recording of today, along with a few other pieces of information. And just a reminder for the CPE credit, you do need to answer 3 out of 4 polls. I know we were a little pressed for time today in order to get that CPE credit. Thanks everyone so much, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.